Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to the cabinet, fellow colleagues, and all protocol duly observed. Thank you, Rose, for the warm welcome. Thank you to the Institutional Learning and Knowledge Management Office for putting this together. And I am pleased and honored to be here for the fourth book talk series. Today, we'll be talking on migrations, and I'm sure most of us in this room are very familiar with the topic called migrations. And before I start, first off, I'll give the overview of how I will be doing the book talk presentation. The first half would be on general migration trends around the world, and then the second half, which would be much longer, that would be the part that I go into the book that I'll be discussing. The book today is titled Migrations, New Short Story Fiction from Africa. And this is a book I co-authored with 21 other authors in 2017. So it's been a while. However, the content of the book is still very relevant today, very relevant to the OSC, very relevant to the Global South. So if you would indulge me, I would simply start by asking, by a simple show of hands in the room, how many people in this room have migrated, whether within your country or within another country? If you have migrated, please raise your hand. So basically, I think the entire room has migrated, which is what I expected, actually. And out of all those who have raised their hands, can we have two people tell us why they migrated, the reason? So whether it was for school, for work, family, just two people, or otherwise I'll have to call people out. But two people, please volunteer to tell us the reason why you migrated. Okay, Miguel? For school? Okay, where did you migrate to? Where did you travel to? United States. Okay, from? Venezuela. Awesome. Okay, one more. Usa? I said I would call someone. Do you care to share with us where you migrated from and for what reason? OSC. All have reasons why we migrate. And I will share my personal story. Ethiopia is my fifth country. Ethiopia is the fifth country that I have personally lived in. And for more than half of my life, I've lived outside of the Gambia. I'm originally from the Gambia, in case anyone was wondering. And more than half of it, I have spent it outside of the Gambia. And I have lived in Nigeria, in the United Kingdom, the United States, Ethiopia, Gambia itself, a bit in Senegal as well. So the point being that our migration stories are impacted and influenced by many reasons. And as we get to know, nowadays, migration tends to have a negative connotation. Most times when we hear migration in the news, it's talking about illegal migration. It's talking about people who are moving from one place to another, but they're not coming through the right channels, whatever we describe as the right channels. And you see migration within the Global South, you see migration within Global North countries, you see migration between Global South and Global North. You see even regional migration, even within Ethiopia, you see from rural areas to urban areas. You see it across. So migration, I believe, is a part of human nature, is a part of human endeavor. It's part of who we are. And with that, I think you can look at the different types of migrations. You've got rural-urban migration. You've got climate-induced migration. Nowadays, people are moving as a result of climate change. You look at the Sahel region, for example, where lots of people are moving, searching for where they can have their better livelihoods because of the reduce in raindrops, because of the reduce in access to water. And these are even causing clashes. In Nigeria, for example, you've got the farmers and the herders clashing. From the north, you've got the herders who are moving down to the south to graze, and in the process destroying some of the crops, some of the plants of the farmers in the south. And this has led to conflicts, this has led to communal clashes, which the government at various regions have not been able to stem, because to stem it, you need to understand the root cause, and climate is a part of that. We've got cross-border migration, countries that have very porous borders with neighboring countries, and people are moving from one country to another, as well as in some cases, terror activities are moving between border countries. You look at the Sahel region with Niger, Mali, Nigeria, you see these cross-border conflicts that are happening. It's in part because of migration. Then you look at the refugee crisis, for example. Nowadays, I think we're all aware of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and the refugee crisis that is already emerging and will emerge whenever the war does come to an end. And you look at, even within Nigeria, you have lots of internally displaced people as a result of the Boko Haram conflict. All of these are different sources of migration, and we may or may not be directly impacted by them, but our lives are somehow touched by migration. Whether you're traveling with an aircraft, whether you're traveling by land or by sea, we're somehow impacted by these. But the specific aspect of migration which I want to touch on today is on brain drain migration. Brain drain migration, simply put, is a situation where skilled, talented individuals leave their source country, leave their home country, to go to another country where they believe that their talents, their skills would be better rewarded. And perhaps if you search in this room, you would find a lot of people who have partaken in brain drain migration, whether they're aware of it or not. But most of us, in one way or the other during our lifetimes, would participate in some form of brain drain migrations. What we call experts in white-collar jobs, that's a form of brain drain, because your expertise is not being used in just your home country. You're exporting it to another country. And you're leaving your home country, which is the source country, and going to what is called the host country, the receiving country. And what you would observe is that for skilled workers, they would oftentimes be more welcomed than unskilled workers. So the skilled workers would be called the experts, would be called the diplomats, whichever terms we choose to call them. However, for the unskilled workers, we call them illegal migrants. We call them, oh, they're stealing our jobs, or they're stealing from us, you know. You cannot steal what can't be stolen. So I don't believe in the idea of stealing jobs in that sense, because typical economics tells us that markets exist for a reason. If there's a demand for certain jobs and there's a supply, they will meet at the equilibrium, and then market forces would determine the prices, as we all know. So with brain drain migration, what you see is the pattern that exists in terms of brain drain migration. Typically, it's from the global south to the global north. And why is this? You have to go back to understand how the world theory system explains it. The world theory system, which breaks down the global economy into three. You've got the core, you've got the semi-periphery, and you've got the periphery. And with the core, you've got the global north, the most developed countries, and then in the semi-periphery, you've got the developing countries. And out in the periphery, you've got the least developed countries. And as research and as time has shown, the periphery countries have been the ones to produce the resources, natural resources for the core, for the development of the core. And as a result, the core has developed much faster and much more consistently over time compared to the core. You take Congo, for example. We're all fully aware of Congo's contribution to the telecommunications industry in terms of production of mobile phones and a lot of other technological gadgets. However, Congo produces the resources, but Congo itself doesn't produce the phones themselves. You take the price of cobalt, what Congo sells it for, and you take the price of a single iPhone, it's quite a disparity. And this disparity shows in bigger terms why you have some of the richer countries of the world situated in one part of the world, and you've got the much poorer countries situated in another. And it's usually extractive. You take the same even for oil, for example. You've got Nigeria with oil, Angola with oil, Algeria with oil within Africa, but they don't make the same resources off of it. They don't make the same revenues, the same gains off of this compared to the way the United States make resources off of oil, revenues off of oil, or the United Kingdom, the Netherlands. Looking even at the size of the Netherlands, quite small compared to some of these countries, but in terms of economic power, in terms of economic strength, it's way ahead of these countries that have the resources. Why is this important? People in the global south have the rights, have the freedom to choose where they want to move to, where they want to migrate. And as a result, logically thinking, you move to places where your talent, your skills would be adequately rewarded, would be rewarded financially, would be rewarded professionally, would be rewarded in terms of what your family can also benefit from it. So someone thinks of it in the sense of, if I stay in my home country, I'm an engineer, I don't get a job that I want, or I get a job that's not paying me enough, how much can I survive on it? However, if I move to another country that's going to value my talent as an engineer, that's going to pay me the money that I deserve, that's going to take care of my family, it's a win-win for me. And most times when you look at it, the countries would say, oh, you're not patriotic, why are you not staying back home? But it's not about that, because most times, and economists have studied this, most times we forget about the rights of the individual. And William Easterly, a former World Bank economist, put it this way in one of his books, that it's the forgotten rights of the poor. So we don't believe that they have rights to choose. You should take what you're given in your country and just accept it. So once you move out, you're not seen as patriotic as you should be, and things of that sort. However, I disagree with that idea that you should stay put. I think as humans, we have the right to choose, and to choose where to move to for whatever reason we want to move to. Sometimes we move out of our choice, sometimes we're forced to move. There's political persecution, there's climate change like I mentioned, there's lots of economic reasons that can create situations where people have to move away from their city, away from their countries, which is normal, which should be accepted, because that is respecting the rights and the choices of individuals to choose how they want to live. When you also look at the dynamics between the global north and the global south when it comes to migration, most times in the global south, we need visas to go to global north countries. And depending on the strength of your passport, it can determine how many visa stamps you can get easily or how hard it can be to get those visa stamps. That's a given. And even when you look at the relationship between colonized countries and their direct colonizers, there is no direct entry. You take, for example, the Gambia, an English-speaking country colonized by the British, you need a visa to go to the UK. You take Senegal, for example, Senegalese need a visa to go to France. However, within the global north, a British person, before, of course, the emergence of Brexit and all of that, could easily go have lunch in London and then have dinner in Paris easily, without any restrictions. Meanwhile, for those they colonized, those they believed that needed to be like them, especially in the French policy of assimilation, to assimilate, to be like us, it's basically, you still need a visa. And this visa process has become a thing of depending on how much money you have. For anyone who perhaps in here has schooled in the United States, for example, you'll know part of the process of going to school there would include showing your bank statement. How much money do you have? Can you pay for the full 4 years of your program, or however much long? Essentially saying, we don't want you to be a burden when you come here. Fine and good. Okay, but that is only done in a way that disproportionately affects people from the global south. However you look at it, it disproportionately affects us. And when you look at some of the statistics that backs this up, for example, you have 281 million international migrants as of 2020 across the world. That's a massive number. If that was a country, that would be perhaps the largest country in Africa, because Nigeria, which is Africa's largest population, is 200 million. Here you've got more than almost 300 million international migrants spread across the world. And when you look at Africa in particular, you've got about 14.7, 14.8 million internationally displaced people within Africa. And this is accounting for those displaced by war, those displaced by climate, those displaced by political persecutions. It's quite a huge number you're looking at. And all this migration becomes a pressure on the host country, whoever is hosting these migrants. It could be neighboring countries. It could be faraway countries where agreements are agreed upon based on economic needs. But at the end of the day, you have a lot of pressure on the host countries. And when you look at some of the shift in terms of migration, in 1990, for example, there were about 700,000 Africans living in OECD countries. And as of 2015, that number had gone to more than 3 million Africans living and working in OECD countries. So you're seeing the shift. But again, it's still not as easy as some people might assume that, oh, the narratives say, oh, there are lots of maybe Africans coming into a particular country, or lots of Latin Americans moving to particular countries. The narrative is quite biased. And in part, the media sometimes does play a role in how these narratives are curated and how these narratives are spread across. However, when you look at some of the numbers, for example, you've got about 7.4 million Venezuelans, for example, who are currently displaced. Displaced for two major reasons, one political, one economic reasons. And this has been the case since 2015. And Colombia has been one of the countries that has hosted a lot of these displaced people within Latin America. Brazil has also hosted quite a lot of displaced people, and that's the case you find across Latin America and the Caribbean region. And looking at it from another perspective of the impact of migrants, the UAE, for example, 88% of its population is made up of migrants, which means that the Emiratis themselves account for less than 20% of the total population. And that is because you look at the Burj Khalifa, you look at all of the nice buildings in the UAE, a lot of it is being built by migrants. But then what rights do these migrants have? What are they seen as? Are they seen as experts in building? Or are they seen as migrants who can be used for cheap labor? So when we look at migration, we have to look at it from many different lenses. We cannot look at it from a one-dimensional point of view. And another aspect of migration which people tend to ignore about is the aspect of remittances. Majority of migrants send home what is called remittances. They send money to their families, to their loved ones for various reasons. And as of 2022, that was almost 700 billion that was sent by migrants to various countries across the world. And some of the top recipients were India, China, Mexico, Philippines, and Egypt in terms of recipients. And in terms of countries that these monies came from, they came from the United States, the UAE, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as from Germany and Switzerland. But one thing that's important to notice that out of the top recipients, Germany and France are in the top 10 recipients of remittances, which actually one might ask why that is. But that is so because you've got families who are staying there. You've got people who have families who are staying there who are also in other developed countries who send back money for their families in Germany, for their families in France. And as a result, they are part of the top 10. For example, Nigeria, which is one of the other African countries in the top 10, accounted for about 17 billion in terms of remittances. And remittance is important because when you look at, for example, the Gambia, remittances account for about 60% of our total GDP. So that's a huge number. So the Gambia economy depends quite a lot on these remittances. So I think this, like I mentioned, is just a general overview so we understand where we are with global migration. And I think in one of my research that I have done, I have proposed the term to use opportunity equilibrium. And I define opportunity equilibrium as the demand and supply of skilled and unskilled laborers in the international scene that allows for everyone to have access to labor as they so desire, as opposed to brain drain, which focuses just on the skilled and excludes anyone that is not considered skilled. Moving on to the second part of this book talk, which is about migrations, this book. So this book, like I mentioned, contains 21 authors, and I am one of the authors. This book came about because, as the name goes, New Short Fiction from Africa, The book is published on the shortest day of the year in Africa, thus it's called Short Story Day Africa. And as a result, the 2017 edition was focused on migrations, where all the different authors across Africa wrote about migration from their lens, from their view. And I wrote about migration from the context of the Gambia, given that I'm from the Gambia. And yes, it is fiction, but my story in this book is actually influenced by true life events and true life stories. So my chapter is called Taimom Winrekla. Taimom Winrekla is a Wolof word which means as of today, winning is the only thing that matters. And as I believe all of us in here have taken a look at the book, you would understand why winning is all that matters when there are no other choices left for you to have. The book focuses on a couple of themes. One of them is about community. And the way I wrote the chapter, the way I wrote the book, starts out with a local community that did not have a football team, but they had very talented players. But like the Ubuntu meaning I am because we are, is essentially what happened in this community. You've got great individual players, great talented people, but they don't play together. And that reminds me of one thing here at the OSC, which is the club. You've got lots of countries who are good on their own, thriving on their own, but better off together. It's the same concept that happened in this community when they decided to finally establish their own football team. Football, as many people would know, unites people, and more so in the Gambia, it's almost a religion. People watch it, people support their teams to the ends of it. Whether they're watching at home, whether they're watching together with friends, or wherever it might be, people were listening on radios. That is the impact of football in the Gambia, and I would say in most parts of Africa. The beautiful game is a uniting factor. And not only did it unite people to play sports, but it united families to contribute together in this community that the story is set out in. And though it's a poor community, it's one that garnered support from those who were privileged enough. As noted in the book, you've got a government official who stays in the community. You've got a UN official who stays in the community. But then it becomes a burden when you've got a few well-to-do people in the midst of a lot of poverty. It doesn't mean that the community is any better. So, for lack of a better word, the community was quite a poor community. And so football brought them together. They played for quite a while, and eventually they made it to the tournament wherein they got all the way to the semifinals before losing. And they had a couple of star players, which I mentioned, Bazu, Carlo, Bamba, have a couple of them who were in the team. But what does this story really take off? So the story doesn't take off till the migration bit happens. And as you will notice, I mentioned as the author that I moved to Nigeria, which was the case. I personally moved to Nigeria with my family, and as a result, I left back the community behind. But you can move, you can leave the community behind in terms of physically moving, but the community doesn't leave you behind. The values doesn't leave you behind. It sticks with you. And so I stayed tuned with the community, and as it mentioned, again, it's fiction, so some of it are made to sound a bit easier for the reader. However, it's based on true events. The real theme of the book, which is personal and dear to me, is the story about Bakwe. So Bakwe is a Gambian term developed to describe irregular migration from the Gambia, with the goal being to get to the global north, Italy, Spain, Malta, Gibraltar, typically. And to go on this journey, typically you would have to travel through a couple of countries. So from Gambia, you'll move through Senegal. From Senegal, you'll either go through Mali or Niger. If you go through Mali, then you'll follow through Algeria. Then from Algeria, you'll go through Morocco. And from Morocco, you get on a boat hoping to get to Spain. So it's quite a chain. It's quite a lot of countries. It's not a straightforward path. It's not a flight from Addis and 4 hours later you're in Abuja. No, it's not that case. You've got another option where you leave from Gambia, you go through Senegal, from Senegal to Niger. And Niger, as many of you are aware, is a very hot part of Africa, hot part of the world. It's majority desert, similar to Mali. And in Niger, you then go through Libya, and then from Libya, you try to find your way to Italy or to Malta. However, the journey is not as easy as it is. And in the story, the main characters, 3 of them, embarked on this journey with one goal in mind. Just like I asked at the start, why do we move? Why do we move from one place to another? That was the point. They moved to seek a better future for themselves because they believed they could go to Europe, play football, make money, send back to their families. That's the goal. Ensuring that their families have a better life. It seems very well thought of, but like one economist once said, excuse my language here, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So you think you're going to the right place, but then it's not taking you where you might be going to. And that is what happens with the characters in the book. So they seek funds from their family, again, at all costs. I want to go, you must take me there. So families sell off their belongings, sell off their lands in some instances to send them, because you believe that if he succeeds, we all succeed. That is the rationale behind the migration story that is deemed the back way. And so they embark on this journey and they don't make it, besides one person. Some die on the way going to Libya. And I think if most of us in this room are aware of the migration stories in Libya and in North Africa, it's quite dangerous for a lot of people seeking a better life because there's kidnapping, there's exploitation, there's a lot of trafficking, child trafficking, and even death. There are people who are imprisoned in part because of the color of their skin, and their families never hear about them again. There are Gambians who have gone on this journey, and then their families back home think, oh, my son or my daughter is in Europe, and then you get a phone call that says, give us $10,000 or your son or daughter is going to be killed. That's it. And you're thinking, I couldn't even raise the money to help them on the back way. How am I going to raise $10,000 to free them? You never hear from them. So now it's a case of hope. You hope that one day they tell you, oh, I made it alive. But that is not the case for a lot of families. They never make it alive on that journey. However, if you're lucky enough to make it to the end point of the land journey, which would be Algeria, Morocco, or Libya, you might think you're lucky for now. But then you have to get on a boat. And the boat in the story basically takes you into Europe. And these boats are very small boats where it's cramped up because you've got people who are basically mercenaries who man these boats and they collect as much money as they can. So a boat that's designed to take 10 people can easily take 30 people as long as you're willing to pay. And you don't have a choice because what poverty has done to you is it has put you in a desperate situation. And like I mentioned, you don't have choices. And so for a lot of people, this journey becomes a journey of necessity that you'd rather die in the sea than to die at home due to poverty. So your choices are quite bleak, which is the case for the characters. And on the way in the high seas, you encounter a lot of turbulent waters, you encounter patrol boats, police boats, and not many make it. Oftentimes we hear migration stories of police arresting migrants, of boat capsizing, because the boats are not designed to take the amount of people they take on these journeys. So as a result, what happens is that you get on it with the hope, and at some point, stories have emerged where in the middle of the sea, the operator of the boat decides the boat is too full. We need to do something. And that something means some people will be thrown into the water. It's a natural selection. No, there is no choices. There is no, oh, okay, let's wait for another boat. You're in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. You can see Europe in the distance. You can see Africa back from where you are, but there's nothing to do. And so it's a survival of the fittest, which exactly is what happens in the story. And the story ends on a sad note. It ends on a tragic note because Bazu survives, but then, Carlo survives, and then Bazu, his close friend, whom he played football with for many years, he watches him as he drowns and he dies. And the troubling part is not just seeing that, but going back home, if you can, to tell their families that your son, your daughter did not make it. That is a very tragic story. And this, like I mentioned, it is fiction, yes, but it's based off of true life incidents, true life stories. And one thing why it has been hard to stem in the Gambia is because of the few success stories. So in Carlo's case, for example, where he survived, he went into Europe, he worked, he earned money, and then he came back to the Gambia. People see that and they don't see the struggle of the many years it took, of what the journey entails, and they believe if he can do it, maybe my son and daughter can do it as a means to get out of poverty. But it's not the case. The percentage of people who do make it is very, very rare. And why is this book important? Why is it relevant to us here at the OSC? Specifically in the aspect of endogenous technology and value added. If your most talented youth, your most talented people are seeking opportunities outside, and the back way is one of them, you're losing a lot of talented people. You're losing talented footballers, talented would-be teachers, would-be doctors, engineers. You're losing quite a whole lot of people who, if the right environment was present at home, would be able to develop your endogenous technologies, would be able to build your institutions, economic, political, health, social institutions. But for the lack of the right environment to thrive in, they're left with no choice. And there's a true life story actually where a Gambian player, she was playing in the women's team, decided that she wanted better for the backway journey, and unfortunately she died in the high seas. And that was quite a story, but her story is one of many talented people. And personally, I have a close friend of mine whose brother embarked on the journey. Though his brother's story is a success story, if you want to call success as reaching the end goal, which is Europe, and working and then sending back, he's done that. But what you lose is you lose a lot in terms of the mental capacity, the mental stress that is placed on you when you embark on this journey. And he spoke about how he was imprisoned in Libya for a couple of months, and they found a way to escape, and he was being put in a boot of a car, transported through the Sahara Desert. He thought he was being kidnapped. And then eventually he was finally able to find his way. So this is a story that is quite prevalent. And that is why when I wrote this book, I didn't just write it because I enjoy writing, which I do, but I wrote it because I think it speaks about the Gambian people. It speaks for a lot of Gambian people who may not be able to articulate. And perhaps I'm not even the best person to articulate their stories for them. But I think what I have done with this book at the time, which is still relevant, is to open a conversation. What can we do? How do we keep our best talents if we want to develop now and in the future? How do we go about doing that? And just to wrap up, I would talk about just about 3 or 4 impacts of the back way in terms of community. So nowadays, what you observe in a lot of communities is that it's fragmented. Fragmented because a lot of the youth have left the rural areas for urban areas. And then from the urban areas, they embark on this journey. So the rural areas are deserted. A lot of young people are no longer participating in agriculture. They're no longer participating in any productive activities in rural areas. The goal is get to the urban, from the urban, you move out. And as a result, you see families are now hoping that one day their source of survival, their savior from poverty, from economic strain, would be that one person who leaves and goes out, especially when you see maybe a neighboring family that has a success story. Again, a success story with a lot of asterisks. So you see that communities are being fragmented. In the book, there's a point where Sully mentions that, remember how we were all together, and I think the author asked Sully, what changed? And he said, well, before we were able to stand for each other very well, so you don't feel the impact alone. But nowadays it's fragmented because everyone has to survive on their own. And as a result, no one is standing with each other as they used to before. And that is one of the impacts of the back way. Another aspect of it is families are selling off properties in a bid to sponsor their children, cousins, whatever it could be, with the hope that the returns would be much greater, but it's not always greater. You also have another impact, which is a lot of lifetime scars, because sometimes some people make it all the way into Europe, but then they get deported back. So you come back home and you come back with nothing. And though, yes, this is a Gambian story, I think you could expand this to a lot of African countries, African migration. For example, you tend to see a lot of migration even here in Ethiopia with young girls to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE for domestic work. And for the most part, the rights of these young girls are not a thing. Rights doesn't exist. You're just there to work. You have someone who you would pay a certain percentage of your earnings, your income to, and anything could happen to you. Your family believes, oh, you're there to make a better future, help them back home. So the same thing happens in Senegal. In Nigeria, you've got even a bigger migration problem called the Japa movement. This one is more of a middle class one because it's it's quite expensive. Expensive because those leaving are not the wretched of the earth, as you would call them. Those leaving are bankers. Those leaving are people working in government offices. And you're thinking, why? But the question is, why not? Because when you have money, you think you can solve a lot of problems, right? But then Nigeria and a lot of other African countries, not just Nigeria, shows you that money is not enough. And I'll give a simple example. You've got money, you're a banker, everyone sees you, oh, good job, nice car, nice home. You're sick, you go to the hospital, they tell you there's no oxygen, and it might be one of the best hospitals in town. Now your money can't do much for you. You go to get medications, they tell you, oh, this specific medication is not available. You know, it has to be imported because, of course, we don't produce it here. So you can't do much in that case. And it's the same case for a lot of, so it's not even just a Nigerian case. You look at even Pakistan, for example, India, the amount of migration into the UK is even much more than Nigerians, you know. You look at Nicaragua, El Salvador, you know, the migration, Mexico, migration into the United States, into Canada and other places, it's quite a lot. So the long and short of migration is that sometimes when your back is pushed against the wall, you have no other choice. And it might be easier for others to say, oh, well, I mean, you can just get a job or you can just find a way. Sometimes the only way people believe, especially like I mentioned in the case of the Gambia, is through the back way. And as a result, one of the most tragic impacts of this back way is the loss of lives. And worse off, loss of lives that doesn't get reported. So your family will never know if you are alive or if you're not, because there's no one to come back to say, this is what happened. So it's a case of hope, it's a case of desperation. But I think, to wrap it up, I think the Gambia story is one that promises hope. It's one that promises to one day stop the stem and reverse the flow. Whereas instead of going out, people are wanting to come back to the Gambia to develop it in many ways, because yes, we are one of the smallest countries in mainland Africa, population about 2 million people, quite a small strip of land within the Senegambia region. However, we are one such that we believe in a Gambian word called Mbolo. Mbolo means community, it means togetherness. And it is one of the things that I believe and I hope that as Gambians, we never lose, because it's one of the things that keeps us together and shows us who we are. So I think that wraps up my talk on this book, Migrations. And if you haven't read it, you can take a look. If you have, I guess after Alvaro gives his thoughts and comments, then we shall go into questions. And one of the reasons I chose Alvaro was because I think we have some great similarities. He's lived in Gambia. He knows the Gambia very well. And more so, he's a King's man. We went to the same institution. Of course, not at the same time, but a year apart. So I thought, why not select him to speak on it. Thank you very much.
Good evening. How are we today? So I don't know if I can really help you to understand better the book, but I can give a couple of thoughts. Also, first of all, I would like to appreciate the invitation. Thank you, Francis. I needed more job. And, it's not enough with my workload, so it's good to be here. First, I would like to touch upon the short story. I think it's a very powerful story, and I really like it. I think it reflects very well the intimacy of these individual stories. It reflects the dreams, aspirations, the collective and individual, the sorrow as well, and how a lot of people experience something they will not choose to do in other situations. I was reading this report of IOM on the Gambian migration, and one of the key findings was that the return intention of the migrants is very high. So if the solutions to these financial, economic problems could be found in the Gambia, in this case, in the home, they will stay. So I think this is an important reflection on what fires this desire to take the back way. Also, as Francis said, one of my migrations, although I think I've been called more like an expert, I stayed some time in the Gambia. And I personally know some of my friends took this journey. Some made it and some didn't. So here I would like to make also a reflection, because my thoughts would be in this line about the narratives. How the narrative of success, one success story, counts a lot more than any other. Any people missing in the sea, any trafficking stories, that doesn't matter if you can make it and fulfill the dream to provide back home. I think also the back way as a concept and the individual stories behind it encapsulate the necessity for transformation in the economic and production models in the South. And I think in these places where the OSC can play an important role, particularly the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education, I think provides a powerful foundation. In particular, the pillar of contextuality, I think, can address particular problems like this one. And other part of the OSC as the strategic sectors. One of them is high value-added industrialization. And again, I think this Francis already commented, but I think it would be very important to provide the solutions needed in country. And the second main point I would talk about is more broadly about migration, but the global narratives about it. In particular, also as Francis has already mentioned, these narratives are arising mostly from the north, but we can also witness in the south, in countries like Bangladesh or South Africa, where migration is seen as harmful and the migrants are dehumanized. Migration and this particular negative view has increasingly permeated political movements, media narratives, and public discourse in many countries. In this sense, these narratives have become an excuse to use migrants as scapegoats for deep-rooted societal problems, fears, or for political gain, in many cases. When migrants all around the world are criminalized, are dehumanized by policies, rhetoric, action, the result has two ways. On the one hand, the most obvious is you leave these people without human rights, without a place in the societies, but also it affects the hosting societies or the societies, let's say, expressing these narratives, because it expresses the moral bankruptcy of these particular societies. In this sense, there is a phenomenon in political science called securitization. In this case, securitization of migration. This is an act of speech, is a discursive framing of migration as a threat to the nation, to the society, to the culture or religion. By securitizing immigration, the basic way of understanding, evaluating, and handling the phenomenon is subjected to a specific logic of survival, which prioritizes and justifies particular policies and measures aimed at neutralizing the perceived security threat. For instance, in the peak of migration flows to Europe mostly, from Africa, just building on our today's example, it was around 2014, 2015. This exposed serious flaws in the EU's asylum system, and the commitment to that asylum has become increasingly conditional. Europe, together with much of the global north, is working on a number of initiatives to attract highly skilled migrants. It's the same as Francis was mentioning as brain drain, but from the other side. At the same time, it has taken increased measures to keep the unwanted out. The EU and a number of its individual member states have opted for closing the borders, tightened their migration policies, and as well building physical barriers, walls, trying to limit these migration channels. But in doing so, as I was saying before, it undermines the moral, legal, philosophical, and as well as economic accounts of the countries. This, in my opinion, reflects the moral bankruptcy of this region, of these countries. Much both of the political and broader public debate have begun to depict immigrant flows as an invasion. And all of this, my point is being done as a narrative, as a story. Consequently, migration has become predominantly addressed through the security nexus, and the borders represent these protective yet vulnerable barriers from the perceived threat coming from the outside. If securitization of migration has led, as I've been saying, to the moral bankruptcy of the North, but also it has polluted the global debate and the understanding of migration, as migration now is mostly taken from this point of view. And this doesn't reflect the reality of the phenomenon. It's not even a small part of it. Furthermore, two small points. One is we have to challenge this predominant idea that migration flows from the south to the north. This is only a small part of global migration. For instance, in Africa, most of the migration movements occurs within the continent. Even I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in the case of Gambia, Gambia hosts more migrants than export migrants. However, you would never think that. The second point is, while I'm telling you narratives are part of the problem, I think they can also represent a powerful tool for positive change. And I think, for instance, this sort of story by our colleague is an example of it. You can frame it, you can identify it better, feel more related to, understand much better. There is an opportunity to reframe this mobility as a positive force and disengage with the imposed narrative from North, a threat, etc., that keeps framing migration as an existential threat. And connecting with our organization, I think, for instance, programs like Freire can contribute very much into a positive reinforcement and a transformative narrative in relation to mobility within the South. In any case, always based in solidarity and not charity. Just concluding, I would like to maybe point out a couple of points that maybe, Francis, you can comment on. One would be which structural transformations are needed to avoid this undesired migration, such as the back way. And also, if you can comment a little bit about these narratives about migration, how can we balance the negative imbalance? And what do you think of the real power of these narratives and their limitations? Thank you very much.